There we go. All right, welcome everybody. I'm so happy you're all here. My name is Ben Grosscup. I am the executive director of the People's Music Network for Songs of Freedom and Struggle, normally in Massachusetts, but visiting my family in Minnesota this week. So the People's Music Network sustains and grows a diverse community of artists, activists, and allies who use music, poetry, and other art forms as catalysts for a just and peaceful world. And I want to just say that by assembling here on this very Zoom call today, you are the community we seek to sustain, to support, to grow. And thank you for being here. As I mentioned, we are recording this session, and shortly after, like within a day or so, probably after the session concludes, you're going to get an email with a notice that has a link to this video recording. And if someone needs to miss a session, that's okay. You'll be able to check the recording afterwards. I have posted a discussion forum. So the idea is that David Rovics, who I'm about to introduce, is going to be giving lots of great knowledge to us. There's so many things to know about being a troubadour. And so we want to encourage the use of the PMN website, particularly the discussion forum function on the website, so that people can delve more deeply into some of the questions that come up during this session that we might not have time to fully explore. I also want to let you know that the title, How to Be a Troubadour in the Age of Crowdsourcing, that is the title of this workshop series. It is also the title of a book that David wrote. And David has generously offered us access to this book. So the link has been provided in the various confirmation messages that have gone out, and just hope that people will maybe take the time to look at, think of it as like supplemental reading to a course, on the whole subject. And I'll let David say a little more about that. But by way of introducing our presenter for today, we are very lucky to have David Rovics with us. He has been traveling around the globe for many decades, using his music to build up the global justice movement. And the global justice movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental justice movement, and many other movements. And while he's been devoting his life and his musical craft to movement building, he has also set an example for us as a community for what it can mean to make a living as a traveling musician and to do that as a movement building artist. So I guess it was in June of this year, David co-facilitated a workshop at the People's Music Network Summer Convergence. And that was co-facilitated with Pat Humphreys and Sandy Opito of Emma's Revolution, a wonderful group that you should check out. That initial conversation helped spur the idea for this series to take place. And I just very grateful to you, David, for joining us. I'm going to recede into the background in just a second and bring you on here. And I'm going to let you talk a little bit about anything you want to say, including kind of the overall plan for this series.
Thank you, Ben. It's wonderfully facilitated workshop here. And yeah, it's great to see everybody here in the Zoom room. And so when I wrote the book, which is only slightly dated, I mean, basically in 2006, I wrote a booklet for PM Press, which they basically asked me to write about how to be how to write songs and make a living as a traveling songwriter, basically. And it was called Sing for Your Supper. And much of that book, anything practical other than songwriting in that book, like anything about actually making a living, became almost completely dated over the course of the 10 years or so. And then I wrote another updated version of it, which I never published. But anyway, that's the booklet that Ben's mentioning, and you're all, of course, welcome to have a free copy if it's of any use. It's now 4 years old, so it is actually at this point dated in a number of different, probably fairly important ways, because as you are probably aware, this, at least as far as the logistics of trying to survive in any way as a musician, is a phenomenon that is constantly changing, as with any other form of the arts these days. But the but it doesn't constantly change in terms of the fundamentals of the art itself, you know, but just in terms of surviving as an artist, that is a constantly changing phenomenon. Um, but um, but I divided the book into basically three sections, and the first section is on writing songs and playing music and performing, and the second section is on basically sharing your music, meaning yeah, recording it and in different forms, and what to do on different platforms on the internet, and how to get it out there on music streaming platforms, and performing it in person. So the second section is about basically sharing your music, getting it out there in various forms. And the third, and including monetizing it, but it's not all about the, you know, the money aspect. That's part of the aspects of sharing the music. It's partly also making money from sharing it. But the third section of the book is on all about crowdsourcing and the various ways that crowdsourcing and crowdfunding play a very central role in the lives of most independent musicians and other artists who are, if they're surviving at their craft, it probably involves a lot of crowd-sourced income because of the collapse of the various industries that used to exist, you know, prior to the internet. And which is not to say that the internet is an all bad thing or anything like that. It's just that it has been tremendously influential on the development of many different industries in very negative ways financially, although you know, it's often very positive ways in terms of being able to exchange music and ideas and art with people all over the world. So there's, you know, pros and cons to that whole thing. So I guess that's my kind of synopsis of the overall three workshops, and I will be looking at the chat window. It's just open on my screen here. So anybody that has anything to say that's relevant to anything I'm talking about, I'll be glancing on there, and which I tend to find might help me to clarify or talk more about things that are actually of particular interest to anybody. But I'll just start general and probably, you know, get more specific as we go, which is the, yeah, seems to work as a general kind of rule of doing workshops, which is something I haven't done a whole lot of, actually. I'll just admit here, because I do a lot of touring and a lot of performing and a lot of writing and a lot of concerts and stuff, but I find I'm not really plugged into the scene where, like in festivals, where they're asking performers to do workshops. You know, that's something I do maybe once every other year. You know, prior to the pandemic, it's become a little bit more of a thing I'm doing a little bit more of during the pandemic. You know, online workshops. But I like the idea of skill shares and, you know, workshops like this. I think it's a great thing. That's just, you know, not something I have a whole lot of background in. But so the first section of the workshop today, what we'll be talking about, is writing songs, and so I guess I don't know. I guess it maybe. I don't know how much of my own background, you know, people, you know, necessarily need to know, but I guess it feels kind of funny talking about songwriting when I don't know who knows any of my music or whether I'm any good at songwriting. But I've been a songwriter for, you know, since the 90s. I've been traveling around many different countries and playing music in the context of a lot of different social movements in many different countries. And so as a songwriter, writing about different political events currently and historically that are relevant to different countries, including this one, I have plugged into a lot of different social movements in different countries. And so I sing at a lot of protests, and I sing at a lot of events that are related to different social movements, which then ends up meaning I get more familiar with those movements and then write more songs about things that are happening. So it's kind of a spiral, kind of, you get more ensconced in the countries, in the movements where you're spending time. And so I tend to write a lot of songs that are especially about those movements in those countries where I'm spending time in, you know. So, but the the songs, some of the songs, you know, that catch interest in those movements, and so like, you know, there's songs of mine that a lot of people in Ireland know, for example, or you know, a lot of Palestinians or a lot of Greeks or whatever, different songs that kind of caught on in different places and different social movements. And all of those songs that have caught on anywhere, with very few exceptions, they all have something in common. And this is true not just of my songs, but of a lot of other songs that have caught on in a lot of different social movements. It's not that I mean, there tends to be different types of songs that catch on, but the one type of song that I have written that tends to be of most interest to social movements anywhere are songs that just tell one simple story. And although sort of anthemic, you know, fight songs are also can also be popular in a lot of different sort of social movement contexts, and they are very important. And that's another sort of type of songwriting, I would say. But the type of songwriting that I've focused on mostly through my career has been telling stories, and and songs are a really powerful vehicle to tell a story. And the there's a lot. So I'm going to talk about how to tell a good story in a song, basically, right now, and then we'll move on to other. I haven't organized this whole thing, but I'm going as I'm just, there's just so much information that we could talk about that I feel like I don't really need to structure what I'm going to say, because there's way too much we're not going to get to. Right? This is a huge subject. But if you're telling a good story, I find there are certain, first of all, like for topical songwriting, for writing songs where you're telling a story and you're trying to impart a perspective, but I find, if in my own work and in anybody else's work, if you look at it, you'll often see a consistency, which is that the best stories, the best songs that tell a story that have the most impact on us have certain things in common. And one of those things, with so many of them, is that they don't tell you what to feel or what to think. And and the perspective of the songwriter is not necessarily present in the song. You're not hearing anything about what the songwriter feels or thinks. The songwriter is just telling a simple story and making it rhyme, and making it musically interesting, and hopefully using nice metaphors. But you're basically telling a simple story. And the first mistake of people trying to write topical songs about current events or history is that they tell us what they think, they tell us what they feel. And the second mistake is they try to tell us more information than you can easily fit in a 3-minute song. Like they try to tell more than one story. You can't tell more than one story unless the point of the song is telling more than one story. If you're trying to tell two stories that wrap into each other, and then at the end you're making it clear that they're related to each other, that's fine. That can work great. But otherwise, one story. And all about just simply telling the story. And the best songs oftentimes are deceptively simple. Like you write the song, or you come across the song and Rise Up Singing or wherever, and you think, well, this is just such a simple story. There's no real great detail in here. It's just barely enough information that I need to understand what this story is about, and then it's over. And you know, that's how it often is. You don't need to tell people all that much information. You just need to transport them to the place that you're talking about, whether it's currently or historically. You want to transport them to that place and give them enough of a feeling of the atmosphere in the place you're taking them to, that they feel like they're there, and then you've got them. I mean, a very classic example, just to take an example that I imagine most people probably are familiar with, at least if you're in PMN circles, like if we just take examples of Woody Guthrie songs like Ludlow Massacre. I mean, it's a perfect example where, I mean, I would say Woody actually, he does things that I avoid in terms of the last verse. I think he often could just lose the last verse and it would be a better song. But otherwise, you know, he was a fantastic songwriter. And I think there's a lot of political songwriters that where the songs would actually be better if they lost the last verse where they wrap everything up. And I have long tried to avoid wrapping everything up in the end, because I think it's better if the audience can wrap it up themselves, because of the story concluding in such a way that makes them draw that conclusion anyway. But anyway, I think the Ludlow Massacre is, regardless, an amazing song. It's not necessarily one of the examples of a Woody song that I'd take the last verse out of. But in that song, as in so many of his songs, he's just describing what happened. And you know, and at the end, yeah, as someone, yeah, I said, God bless the mine workers union, and then I hung my head and cried. And I actually think if the narrator of the song had not hung his head and cried, it might have been more powerful, actually, for the listener. I mean, you know, I hope it doesn't seem blasphemous, but there's a lot of songs that were written 100 years ago that I would improve if I were given the opportunity, you know, including lots of songs I wrote 20 years ago. I'd write them differently now, you know. I mean, that's how it is when you're a songwriter. None of these, you know, I mean, I guess there's occasionally a song that where it just seems like every syllable is exactly perfectly in place and I wouldn't do anything with it. But there's a whole hell of a lot of great songs that I'd still kind of tweak a little if I were the one, you know, doing it, you know. Not that they need to be tweaked by me to be great songs or anything, but yeah, I think, you know, Woody Guthrie's songs are often a classic example of why just simple storytelling like that can be so powerful without you know, including a whole lot of extra information or perspective. And a thing that I think is really important to talk about in terms of songwriting, I think it's more important now than ever, actually. And I'll just say that, like, in the 60s, there was, I mean, I think many of us here, to one degree or another, whether we know it or not, are somewhat impacted by the sort of debate between Phil Oakes and Bob Dylan. And it wasn't, I mean, whether it doesn't matter if you've even heard of Phil Oakes, you know, but there's this debate. And it's a kind of a fake debate, really. It was never really real, but because neither Phil Oakes or Bob Dylan ever took their own advice on how to write songs. I mean, they both were experimental and did all kinds of stuff. But Dylan claimed at some point, for a few months or whatever, that you should only write about what you know. You know, and of course, anything Dylan said had a tremendous impact on anybody who was into Dylan. So it became this huge thing that everybody's like, oh, we can't write ballads anymore. You know, we can't write about like history anymore. We have to only write about what we know. Like, I grew up in the suburbs of Connecticut. That's like, what am I going to write about now? Well, I mean, there's lots to write about from the suburbs of Connecticut, but Dylan was full of shit when he said that. He was completely full of shit, and he knew it too. And he had written, I mean, I'd have never met the guy, and I don't know, but I'm sure that he knew he was full of shit, because he had just written 3 albums of great topical material, none of which was first person. He had just written some of the best topical songs that have ever been written in the English language. And then he's saying, oh, you got to write about what you know. He was just fucking with us, you know. He was fucking with his audience. It's not. Yeah, I hope you don't mind swearing. Okay, we're all grown ups here, right? So I mean, but that had a huge impact, and it still reverberates today, and it has now become much more of a thing in the course of the identitarian political cultural revolution, or whatever it is that's happening in the United States today, where we are told by, I don't know, some kids that probably grew up in the same suburb I grew up in, that all of a sudden we really can only write about what we know. And if we write about anything else, then we're somehow stepping on somebody else's cultural grounds, right? And that's just also complete nonsense. And I don't need to be anybody to tell you that's nonsense. it doesn't matter who I am telling you that that's nonsense, because this is easy to demonstrate, because, all you have to do, if whoever has written a song, if that song is sung by me or anybody else in front of an audience that the song is about or related to, and that audience likes the song, it is objectively then a good song. Like, if you write a song from the perspective of a Palestinian refugee and you sing that song in front of an audience of Palestinian refugees, and the room full of refugees starts crying because they all speak English and can understand your song, it is a good song. And it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're a Palestinian or a Jew or white or black or anything. You just wrote a good song. And it may be that it has more potential to be more powerfully delivered if delivered by somebody of a certain background. That can be a real thing for sure. But that doesn't change the quality of the song. The song exists as a song. Art exists as art by itself. Not that it's in a vacuum, but the song is a song, regardless of who wrote it or anything about the person who wrote it, any detail about the person, whether they're a good person, bad person, they abandoned their children, whatever. The song is a good song or it's not a good song. That's it. And you, whoever you are, can write a good song, but the first thing you have to do is forget who you are and get that box out of yourself. You don't need to be in that box. And all these people who are telling you that you should be in some kind of a box are full of shit. You don't belong in any kind of a genre box musically. There's no such thing. That was invented by a racist industry called the record industry, a white supremacist phenomenon that's been around for like 120 years in this country. And it has been putting musical genres and people into these boxes for 120 years. And it's been a terribly destructive influence on our society. But we musicians don't do that naturally. We don't put ourselves into boxes naturally. No real musician does that. People only do that when they're trying to get ahead because the industry tells us we need to put ourselves in these boxes. But real musicians who are just trying to create, who aren't trying to necessarily just get ahead in terms of industry, people tend to just work in genres that they feel like it might be a mix of different genres. There's no they're not playing country music or folk music or hip hop. They're just playing music, and then people call it whatever they call it. It becomes whatever it becomes in other people's eyes. But yeah, so I would say the biggest thing that inhibits all of us as artists when we're trying to write about, to write from, especially from a perspective that may not be ours, which is a hell of a lot of people out there, you can write from their perspective or about other people or historical periods that you had nothing to do with, that happened way before you were born. You can still write songs about all those people and all those places and anywhere in the world, and you can relate to any human experience because you're human. And we have this range of emotional reactions to everything. And all of us who have experienced any kind of a trauma, we can relate to other people who have experienced trauma. And the trauma may not be the same or even, in the same ballpark, but if you've experienced the grief of your dog dying, you've experienced grief. And especially if you grew up with that dog, and you were close with that dog, I'm just taking a common example, but everybody has experienced grief, and everybody can identify with other people's grief. And you can write a song from the perspective of a grieving person from anywhere in the world, from any historical period. And it won't necessarily be good, but it might be. And it doesn't matter who you are writing that song, as long as you're a human being. And the same is true for acting, as anybody knows who's an actor. You are acting a role, and you can get into that role and you can be that person. And it doesn't matter what your background is. Although, of course, it does matter in other kind of political ways. I understand that. That's a different issue in terms of, like, the Oscars so white and all that. I mean, that's, yeah, totally. That it's a racist industry. But taking that aside, fundamentally, as an actor, Daniel Day-Lewis can be whoever Daniel Day-Lewis wants to be. because he's such a good actor. It doesn't matter. You know, he can be anybody. He can speak with any accent. He can be anybody. You know, I mean, maybe he won't look the part if he's trying to be somebody who's not European. But you know, you know, that's what it is to be a good actor. And it's the same with being a good storyteller, songwriter. But you have to get out of yourself first to do anything good with art, and then you can just channel. I know it's a spiritual term, and I avoid spiritual terms. I'm not a spiritual kind of person, but it is channeling in a sense, you know, and not somebody's spirit or whatever. But you're channeling this perspective, and you're allowing yourself to feel whatever it is that that the perspective you're trying to impart. That person, whether or not you're talking about those feelings, that's another thing. You don't want to do that, actually. I think as a good storyteller, you don't want to talk about how you're feeling, but you want to feel how you're feeling. You want to be in that person's shoes. Otherwise, you can't write a good song from their perspective. But then that doesn't mean you kind of spill all the beans and tell everybody what you're thinking and feeling. But you need to be in their shoes, and I think that's that's one of the biggest obstacles to being able to do that. And from my own personal experience, it was it was trauma that opened opened me up to that reality that we're all human, and that we actually don't need to just be in those boxes. Like I had to have my best friend shot to death, like right next to me, basically, to kind of have the kind of grief that was the level of grief where I no longer felt like I'm a middle class white guy from the suburbs of Connecticut. I was just a grieving human being, and being a grieving human being and walking around in the Mission District, which is where my friend was shot in San Francisco, walking around the Mission District, and suddenly, realizing, oh, look at this. Everybody around here, they're all these grieving people, and I suddenly, you see them, people from all over, refugees from all over Central America, most of whom have had family members killed. That's why they came to California, and you did the grief, like where was it the day before? I don't know, but suddenly it's all there. And then once you see the grief on other people's faces, then you realize you can identify with anybody's grief. And then you write a song from the perspective of some grieving person from somewhere else. And then those people from that place, the song takes off, and then suddenly everybody's singing the song around Ireland, and you realize, okay, you nailed something there. You got something that's proof. I mean, it's hard to, there's not really easy proof with these things, but sometimes it becomes clear. Okay, there's like all these bands covering this song. There's, it's getting 1 million downloads a year. Well, okay, that's touched a nerve, and it's easier to know that, especially when you're not famous, because none of my songs get anywhere unless people like them, because they don't get played on the radio or anything like that. So it's sort of, the internet can be very handy that way for seeing, like, okay, what's appealing to people here. And that is kind of, I think I'll talk more, well, in terms of the performing, I think, or however, if you're performing songs that you've written in any context where you have a listening audience, it's a wonderful way to see if the song's any good, because funny songs will make people laugh and sad songs will make people cry. And that's a easy way to measure whether a song is funny or sad. Although you have to have the right circumstances, like a quiet room, people listening, they can hear your voice, they can speak your language, that kind of thing. But, if you have those basic circumstances going for you, then these things are not, it's not just like this mysterious, like art is all subjective and it's all great. No, some of it's great, some of it sucks, and you can measure it according to response of the audience. I mean, unless you're just wanting to make art for yourself, in which case you can, stay at home and do whatever you want. But if you're trying to bring your art to the world in any way, then whether it's appealing to people, but might actually matter. And well, to me, it matters a lot. And it's like kind of the point, but other than just to have fun playing music, it's also to reach people. But whether you reach people or not is actually something that's fairly easily measurable, and not a big mystery, Although if you're on a big record label and they're, spending millions of dollars to promote your song, then I think it is harder to tell. Like, are you reaching people? Do they like the song because it's on the radio all the time, or because they actually like it? Well, that's harder to figure, but most of us don't have that problem. So I wonder if I think I've been running my mouth now for 25 minutes, and I can keep on going, but I wonder if this might be a point to just I know I've been kind of looking at the chats here, but if anybody has any particular direction, or if I've touched on anything that you think, like, you kind of mentioned that and I want to hear more about that. Oh, good, good. How is anthemic songwriting different from storytelling? That's a really great question. Thank you. And so I, I, I guess, let's see. I guess I don't know. I used to think of categories of different kinds of songs, but I think basically for me, it's like there is basically the storytelling and there's the anthemic songs. I guess those are the basic two kinds of songs that I tend to write. Um, Although sometimes I'm trying to intentionally be funny. I'm not sure if that's a different kind of song, because they're often telling a story too. But basically, it's if I'm not telling a story, I'm trying to write a song that is about community and about solidarity and mutual aid and people in some context or another. And it still might be kind of telling a story, but it's more about the feeling and more about like an anthem or a fight song or something like that. And there's often a little bit of a vague, where does one kind of song end and the other begin? But basically, I would say that I mean, storytelling songs still will tend to have a chorus, and the chorus will potentially be an anthemic kind of chorus, even if it's otherwise a song that's telling a story. So there's a lot of crossover there, but then there's the songs that are more like really meant for everybody to sing along with. And I'd say that's one thing that's important for any kind of a anthemic song. If you're writing a song that's meant to be really sung at protests, it should be thinking it in terms of how are you going to get people to sing along with you, or how or at least it's the kind of thing that will tend to have a chorus that's more than just one line. It'll tend to be the kind of thing there's that can rouse people to participate in various ways. But yeah, but I'd say it's not like there's a clear distinction. Otherwise, there's a lot of crossover. I'm looking at music is.
I got one too, David.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just so folks know, we're going to kind of meander a little more into like more of a live Q&A thing too. So if people want to raise their hands, I can take a stack. You can possibly go to your reactions section on your Zoom console and press raise hand, and that will let me know you'd like to speak. But just to kind of engage with one of the things you said, kind of in passing as part of your presentation, but you really spoke to your own experience, David, as someone who's been very directly involved in movement building, and how, when we had a retreat a few years ago as the People's Music Network Steering Committee, we talked about our core values as an organization, and one of them actually was that our members are people who are engaged, in social movements. And I just wonder, since the topic is songwriting, how you see that personal engagement in movements as constitutive of your own songwriting, and how important you see that as a kind of a general thing.
I think you can write great songs regardless of necessarily how plugged you are to movements, potentially, because you can write a great song from nothing but a really well-written newspaper article. Like, all the information you need for a great song can be contained in just one well-written article, and then you might be really relying on that journalist, and like, you really want to know that that journalist really, really knows what they're doing, because that, I mean, if you're not going to be doing more research than just writing a song based on an article, but an article can be plenty. But if you're really plugged into social movements and you're there and you're involved, I think what will tend to happen is, from my experience, is you'll write more songs, and they'll be more specific to a lot of more detailed stuff that you wouldn't necessarily know about unless you were actually there and involved with the movement, which doesn't mean that the song you wrote before you ever went there was bad. I mean, I wrote a lot of songs that I think are some of the best songs I've ever written about Palestine before I ever went to Palestine. But I mean, it's just, I knew a lot of Palestinians, so I mean, but I hadn't actually been to the West Bank, but it's you don't necessarily need to be somewhere or be plugged in, or because you can write great songs about historical events that you will never possibly be at, because it already happened. But I wanted to also mention that point that Dell mentioned. I think it's so important. Is there a niche audience for our topical songwriting, or can it have larger appeal? I'm absolutely convinced that any good topical song can have mass appeal if it's well written. It's not, I mean, with some rare exceptions. If you're trying to write an inside joke kind of song that is going to have just an appeal to people who happen to be members of the Danish Communist Party or whatever, that's fine. That's, you can write a song that's just good for breakfast and isn't going to be good for lunch, and that's just fine. Write a song for breakfast, But if you're trying to write a song, a song about anything topical, I think I always almost always, 99% of the time, I'm orienting towards mass appeal. I know that I may not, it's quite likely that it's just going to, go not much further than my own, circles on social media or whatever, or, email list, but others will go a lot further than that. And so I can definitely say that movement songs can have mass appeal. But the easiest songs that tend to have the most potential for mass appeal, from my experience, are songs that are alluding to the present by talking about a historical event. Like, for example, and this example could be any country. All countries are complicated. Every society is complicated. But just to take one example, which is no more or less complicated than any other example, Ireland. In Ireland, if you write about anything that happened after 1916, then you're potentially only appealing to a certain segment of the population, and you're potentially alienating another segment of the population. It's a very divided country in several different ways. But if you write about anything that happened before 1916, then anybody who believes in Irish sovereignty potentially will like your song. And the only people who won't like it potentially are really hardcore loyalists. And even most loyalists can appreciate songs about Irish sovereignty if it's from before 1916. So I mean, there's a lot of things like that, but I think that that the most powerful songs that can reach the broadest audience are often songs that are employing a certain amount of subtlety by being about a historical event that is clearly alluding to the present. And you don't even need to allude to the present in any kind of overt way. That's a cool thing about history songs, is that you can pick just the right historical event to sing about, where you don't have to say anything about the present, but you are obviously alluding to the present because you're talking about that particular event. So that I find that works really well. And I see Steve has his hand up, and there's more in the Oaks.
Yeah, David, a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this Oaks accused Dylan of losing control of his metaphors. And can you talk about the role and importance of metaphors? But yeah, I want to get to that one too. But yes, please. Question. Is that Steve?
Yeah. In my experience, and probably for most of the rest of the folks on this, a tremendously successful song to be done at street events, at marches, rallies, is a song like Standing by the Water, We Shall Not Be Moved, because it's such a great zipper, or roll the union on, roll the movement on. We're going to roll. Can you suggest anything that might help write such songs that might be used in those kinds of situations?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great one. to see, one of the things that I always struggled with for a very long time was how to write songs that would have the kind of sing-along ability and kind of potential appeal of some of those old Union songs, and or of like most anything that Pete Seeger ever sang, for example. But one thing I learned over the years from my own experience, because I was on both sides of this equation, is that the songs that are easy for lots of people to engage with and sing along with enthusiastically and loudly are not necessarily the easy to sing zipper songs. They are the songs that people have heard before. And while it's also really important to understand the how well those zipper songs work and what a zipper song is, and also just how easily they can be adapted to different situations. So I mean, those old songs and the concept of a zipper song is great in itself, but for those of us out there who have been basically beating our heads against the wall trying to write the classic, really sing-alongable anthem, I mean, arguably some of us have absolutely succeeded in doing it. Pat Humphries being a great example, but it is really so much about what people are familiar with. Like I have a song called "I'm a Better Anarchist Than You." It does not have a chorus. It's like a 3-minute song with no chorus. But anytime I sing that song at so many of my shows, there will be, many people who are there will be singing along with every word. And it's not because it's an easy song to sing along with, it's because they've heard it a few times, more than a few times. And of course, if a song has a chorus and people have heard it a lot, then they'll sing much, much more loudly during that chorus. But if it has a good chorus and they haven't heard it a lot, they're not going to sing with you necessarily, unless it's like a real folk music kind of sing along kind of crowd, in which case you might be able to get them to sing just about anything. But, it's a lot about familiarity. So I would just encourage people who keep on trying to write those anthemic, easily sing-alongable zipper songs, but don't beat yourself up too much if you don't get a lot of people singing along with them, because the songs that people sing along with, from my experience, are not the ones that I expected them to sing along with, are not the ones that I wrote with the intention of people singing along with. Those often just don't go nowhere. Yeah. That's yeah, and I don't know if everybody else has that same experience, but definitely I think that familiarity factor is an important one to to be aware of. And the fact that those, like the pop radio, those songs are catchy, but the reason they're catchy is because you've heard them so many times, partly, and also because they're just catchy because they were written to be catchy, and there's producers worrying about every note from every keyboard and trying to make it catchy, but it's you've heard it a lot. That's the main thing.
Would
Ruby?
it be helpful for me to take stack?
Yeah, sure. I see several hands, and I'm not looking at everybody here. So maybe can you
Great.
do that?
Here's
That'd
what
be
I want to
great.
suggest. I'm going to put this in the chat as well, but Cleo first, and then Jason, Baker, and then Ruby, and then Nell.
But then
Sound good?
yeah, and then before we get to those, just to look at the comments, the written comments, do you write songs to change minds? I just love that question. And I just want to say that I write songs not to depending on whose minds. I mean, not necessarily, but if I'm writing a song, I mean, just to take an example of like right now, 100 years ago this month, 1921, August 1921, the biggest armed multiracial uprising in the history of the United States took place in August 1921 in the hills of West Virginia. 15,000 miners under arms, 2,000 of whom were black, laid siege to the town of Mingo for 3 days and nights. The Air Force dropped bombs on them before the federal troops came and basically put an end to the uprising. So very few people are aware of the Battle of Blair Mountain. And I wrote a song about it 17 years ago. And I wasn't necessarily trying to change minds by writing that song because, but what I want to do is let everybody know that happened. So it is, it can be changing minds. And then other times I'm writing songs specifically to change minds, and that is and my favorite technique for doing that, and I think the most successful song that I've written that has changed some minds is a song. I'm giving away the ending by even telling you what it's about. So hopefully I'm not ruining anything for anybody. I wrote a song about a suicide bomber called Janine, and it was somebody who came from Janine whose parents were killed, and then they became a suicide bomber. A very common story. It's 93% of suicide bombers in the world have a similar story. But but the technique for this song and for a lot of songs I've written, it's one of my favorite things to do it, and a lot of other songwriters have employed it. But you humanize the person you're talking about by only talking about familiar things so that you don't know exactly who this person is and what's going on, but it's all stuff that we all relate to, because it's like having to do with stuff that we all do, like eat and enjoy the smell of a flower or whatever. And then at the end, we suddenly find that this person that we now identify with emotionally and viscerally for the past 2.5 minutes listening to this song about this person, and now this person is blowing themselves up on a bus. So you have to then think about who this person is and why they did that. You can't, at that point, you are no longer emotionally capable of blocking out the humanity of the person who just blew themselves up. You have to accept that this person was a human being. Whatever you think of what they did, you have to accept that they're human, because they've just been humanized for the past 2.5 minutes. And your heart has been opened up to their humanity, whether you liked that or not. And you may really resent the fact that suddenly this person you now identify with has just blown themselves up in a bus full of civilians. You might not be happy about that at all. It might be very troubling, but they were a human being, and you have to accept that. At that point, you can't not accept it anymore. So I've had that song has had that impact on a lot of people, where a lot of people have written me and said, I never thought about the humanity of these people until I heard that song. So yeah, I do try to change minds, and I do change minds. And what else?
Oh, my question. Well, actually, that was one of my
Oh, that was
questions.
one of the text things. No, yes.
That was one
Sorry.
that was answered there. But I also, when you were talking about familiarity and getting people to join in, and that possibly familiarity might be actually be part of maybe changing someone's mind, because like, oh, I keep hearing that. Joe Hill used old church hymns and just changed all the words, and it was kind of funny because I learned the Joe Hill song first, and then someone asked me to sing in a church choir, and I'm like, these are the wrong words. But um,
Yeah.
so would that be like a way of using familiarity to get people acclimatized to what you're saying? And
Yeah, that's a definitely a long-standing technique, is to take songs that people are familiar with, and then put different words to them. And I love hearing like Utah Phillips stories about the IWW doing that, where he says like the Salvation Army band was playing those church songs in front of the Salvation Army in towns all over the country, and so the Wobblies would just rewrite the lyrics and put more sensible lyrics to those songs, as Utah said, and then sing them across the street from the band. So they had their built-in band backing them up, basically. So, I mean, that kind of innovation is wonderful, and definitely using familiar songs that people have heard and then changing the lyrics. It can be, really easy way to quickly get past the problem of people not being familiar with the music, and so they can much more easily and quickly kind of learn the song. If you're trying to get lots of people to sing along with you, that's a really great technique. And I personally never do it, but I think it's great that other people do, and the Raging Grannies are a wonderful example of an amazing network. I mean, the Raging Grannies, I mean, I assume people are aware of them, but for anybody who's not, they started in Victoria, BC, but they have chapters all over the world, all over North America and the world, and that often involve really good songwriters, and people who are rewriting old songs. Generally, they rarely, it's kind of the MO of the Raging Grannies to take old songs that your grandma might have known, and then rewrite them. And that's there's a wonderful also the Climate Canaries is another entity out of Australia that has a great website of all these rewritten songs, to rewriting old songs to give them environmental significance. I mean, that can be done really well or really badly, and when it's done really well, it's really a great thing. And I think it can often be the slightly fraught thing with that phenomenon is that the songs that people are familiar with are often songs that we were made to be familiar with by the corporate music industry. And if they're not songs that the corporate industry made us become familiar with, then they are songs from the 60s, which was the brief period in between, when the corporate music industry was shoving shit down everybody's throats. There was this brief period in the 60s when, they were marketing actually, relevant music. And so because there was this brief period where that was going on, most people in society today, probably most people, I don't know, a large number, when they think of political music, they think of the 60s. And so I think it's easy to rewrite songs from the 60s because everybody knows them, but it's also a very dangerous thing to do. And I would really encourage not doing it, because the 60s, because it just really helps contribute to this idea that the last time there was radical anything going on culturally or in the streets was in the 60s, which of course is not true. It's just when the corporate music industry was selling us political music for a few years. But and there was a cultural renaissance going on at the same time, for sure. But it wasn't just this flash in the pan, and the more we focus on the music of the 60s, the more we help encourage the idea that, the last time anything relevant happened was like when I was a baby, which isn't true.
David, I got the the stack for who's coming up. Should I just keep rattling them
should
off?
Just keep going? Yeah, sounds great.
Great. We got about 38 minutes left here. So I got Jason first, Ruby, Nell, and then Adele, and then Paul.
So hi, David, and thanks for doing this. I just wanted to, I already put my question in the chat, and you had
and then it's up there somewhere up there.
Yeah.
Did I respond to it?
Writing about Phil Oakes and Dylan having not to focus on the 60s, but just that
no, that's fine.
That they had their spat, and you were talking about. I think the comment that had prompted the "you were just a journalist" comment was, in fact, I think you lost control of your metaphors, which is an interesting concept in and of itself, which you could explore. But I'm actually curious about, just on a general songwriting perspective, your perspective on use of metaphors and how to not lose control of the metaphor in that sense of get lost in it and forget to come back to the original thing you're trying to refer to, and how far you go and the proper use of them. That's basically the question. Thanks.
That's a great one. And I think I need to use metaphors more often, and I often do a lot of songs that really involve no metaphors. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask about metaphors. But I find that a well-formulated story with the right word choices, where it's kind of subtle, very subtle, but just in the way that you choose the words, you can bring somebody to a situation or an event without any use of metaphor, or you can use metaphors. Either way can work really well. But if you're using a metaphor, then it's kind of cliche, but don't mix your metaphors. Stick with one metaphor. As soon as you try to work in another metaphor, you've just ruined the song probably. And just like is putting in a word that doesn't rhyme, there's certain things that, like with songwriting, and this is maybe not related to your question, but it's also something that occurs to me is very important to mention, that it's so there. No, what the hell was I going to say? There's just, I'm looking at the text on the screen. I'm really not very good at focusing. I'm very impressed that I haven't lost track over the past hour, in fact. Now, maybe I'll remember what that was. I was going to, The journalist thing, though, I wanted to say, I'm having too many things that I wanted to respond to at the same time. The journalist thing, that I hate that fact that Dylan said that, because there is absolutely nothing wrong with being a musical journalist, and it is absolutely a fine thing to do. If you can write a song that is at least as effective as a good article can be, which, as we know, anybody who reads the news, as we call it, or anybody who's familiar with good journalists, and this is an important point, because the good journalists are good writers. I mean, if you're into Chris Hedges or Robert Fisk or Naomi Klein, it might not be because of the content entirely. It might be because they really write really well. Eduardo Galeano. I mean, you could just John Ross, and there's so many great journalists who are great writers, who are also poets, who may or may not be putting their poetry out there, but it's great. Journalism can be great writing, and songwriting can be bad writing, but you can write a great song or a great article about an event. And I mean, I write both. So now that once I started writing articles, I started writing good articles in 2006. And the reason my articles started getting good at that point was only because it occurred to me that actually these writers that I really like, they're writing so well. It's like they're writing poetry. And so then I thought, okay, I'm going to write an article like I would write a poem. It's not going to rhyme, but I'm going to pay attention to every word. And then, and then everybody started saying, oh, you're such a great writer. Well, that was all I did. I just started paying attention to every word rather than the concept or the basic content. I started, paying attention to writing an article with the kind of attention that you would give to a song. And then you can write good stuff. And if you can write a song in a day, you can write an article in a day. So it doesn't necessarily have to take forever, but it's going to take longer than if you're just kind of basically explain a concept without doing it really with real attention to your use of words. But journalism is a good thing, and writing songs about the news can be a wonderful way to write a song about to write about the news in a way that will actually be remembered much better than an article, just like Joe Hill said. But it's true. What Joe Hill said about that is absolutely true, and I can attest to it.
We could bring in Ruby here.
Yeah. So it's about, and I'm going to, okay, I'm going to put it on gallery then, because all I'm seeing is Ben, which I like seeing Ben, but so it's really about the issue of controversial.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually written a poem about Janine, by the way, because I have visited Janine a long time ago. But that's one of the issues. There could be other issues, for example, the issue of choice and compassion, which is controversial because it hits people. And for people who don't know what that is, that's about medical assisted suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because, somebody is right wing that it's controversial. Or so I'm really wondering, if a way to, because I think you need to mitigate it without being apologetic. And I'm wondering if it makes sense to start a poem. I mean, a song first. There are plenty of songs that start with, well, I've roamed all over this country or whatever. I've seen every port in the world. Something like that introduces you as having thought about this. I lived in Israel and Palestine for 6 years. I'm on the board of directors of a synagogue. I won't say that, but some sort of way that doesn't, because if you launch into something about Palestine, I mean, it's true that if you're in a concert, you could say a few words about it first. It's true that if you write a book, you could say a few words in the introduction to the poem or the song. But it seems to me that should you be writing the first few lines that are kind of an introduction to it? I don't know. What do you think about that? Or I imagine in a concert, or in a book where you have other songs or poems about your grandmother and the class thing, and so it's clear that you're being Jewish, and then the Palestine songs come, you've already done it. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good, in terms of like I would say in terms of performing and in terms of how you do a set list and how you're reaching the audience. That is absolutely, I would like, in terms of writing individual songs, or I would not tend to, introduce myself because I'm not often writing from my own perspective. But in a song like, say, Janine, or some of the other songs I've written about Palestine, it's not clear that it's about Palestine. It's not clear it's about who it's about until the end. And that is, I think, a really important method, because you can humanize people that will automatically, as soon as people find out who this person is, will be dehumanized in the mind. Because all of us growing up in this country, as soon as we hear words like PLO or IRA, we think, angry, violent people. We're inculcated to think. So to talk about people who might be members of the PLO or the IRA, you don't mention PLO or IRA, or you don't even mention necessarily where they are or who you're singing about until, like with Janine, until people identify on a human level with who you're singing about. But that's my method anyway. But in terms of set lists, I think what you're talking about is so useful and so important. Like if I'm like, I don't necessarily have a way I'm always doing, because I'll just try to read the audience and see, where people are coming from. But if you're going to do a song about, say, a suicide bomber in Palestine or something like that, I find it's very important to also sing about other things that make it clear where you're coming from. That you're like, anybody who might think like, oh, is this guy, he really identifies with Palestinians? Does he also identify with Jews? Well, that never needs to be a question for anybody, because I have so many songs about Jews and the Holocaust, and about a lot of other things that are, about lots of fine, upstanding relatives and friends, and and other Jews throughout history. So, there's no question for anybody who sits through one of my concerts that I'm not anti-Jewish, unless being pro-Palestinian in their minds means being anti-Jewish, in which case, so that's where the accusations come from, which I frequently get. But as any of us do who take a stand on this question. Oh, you're muted, Ruby. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, one thing, the poem I have, it's right away, Janine, but it starts off with oods, sighing of love in quarter tones, and sing that, humanize, romanticize. I mean, you fall in love with this place, and then you do know it's Janine, and then you come in with the massacre. So I've kind of tried to do it that way, but yours is an interesting way. But yeah, well, the other thing I thought of was some of my poems I'm translating into Yiddish, which is already a thing. But normally I would read first in English so that people would know what the second language is about when they hear it. In this case, I think I would sing the song in Yiddish first. And then people are, and then
that's a neat approach.
And there
too.
It goes.
Yeah.
So I was just gonna say one process thing about like who's coming up next, but also wanted to say kind of like what sessions are coming up next as well. So we got about a half hour, and just to remind folks, we're in this first session talking about songwriting, and David's been so generous in sharing his approach to songwriting, which is kind of the basis of all this other stuff he's going to be talking about in September and October, which is going to be, I think, you might say it with different words, David, but a little more focused on the practical business end of making a go of this whole craft. Mm-hmm. So, in PMN, we do have like a lot of spaces to talk about like the politics of songs as well, and that's clearly coming up in this session. but just to kind of remind ourselves that like where we're going here, we have a beginning, middle, and end. And the middle comes up in September with kind of talking about recording your music, and October in terms of like crowdsourcing, income, inspiration, and so forth. Yeah, so that was just one note I wanted to let folks know about. And also one other thing that I'll just mention now so I don't have to say it later is that right at about 6:30 Eastern time, everybody's going to get an email with a link that actually lets you sort of give some written evaluation to today's session. And we're going to read that and, you know, reflect on that before the next session. So, so David, if it's okay with you, I'd love to send it to our next question person, which would be Nell, followed then by Paul.
And then also there's on the written bit from Eric, this
yeah, go ahead.
The for songs to have a longer life, for context specific songs to have a longer life. It's a I find that there are a lot of songs that you don't know whether it's going to have a longer life because you don't necessarily know whether what you're writing about is going to be something that is still talked about in 10 or 20 years. But another way, but one thing to make a song that's very context specific work for having longer life that I like to do is just a couple or lines at the beginning of the song that puts the song into the context as succinctly as possible, but in such a way that doesn't detract from the song when you're actually in the present listening to it in the current context. It doesn't sound like you're spending too much time introducing something that everybody already knows about, like Trump's in the White House or something, whatever. But you know, which later might become very irrelevant aspect of the song for people to know. But yeah, I think you can really kind of very briefly sum up where you're coming from at the beginning of the song, to make it work for potentially have a longer shelf life, I think. And
hi, David. I guess
yeah.
I'm up next. So we do the Joe Hill Road Show, and a large part of what we do is we talk about the Wobblies. They're a singing union, and we, as we sing songs, put the lyrics up on the screen, on a big screen behind us, and encourage people to sing along. We used to end all our shows with a circle, everybody doing solidarity, and we used to just sing the chorus and not have the lyrics to the verse up there. And somebody said, hey, put the verses up there because we want to sing the verses as well. So now we put the whole, when the union's inspiration, you know, the whole thing, which are great verses. So that's what we have found about getting people. And, you know, the Wobblies were famous, just like Woody Guthrie, for writing songs and melodies that people already knew. That's why they sold 10,000 copies of the Little Red Songbook, because every Wobbly had the songbook in his pocket, time to sing. He knew the melody. He whips it out and he's got the lyrics in front of him. I mean, that's that part, audience participation, a very important part of it. And we really missed it because we did 8 shows last year on Zoom, and you know, you tell the audience, hey guys, sing along, but you can't tell if they're really doing it. You don't have that immediacy like when you're in the room with everybody as they sing and you can watch their reaction. And, you know, when we get evaluations of our shows, that's one of the things that people always say, man, we love the singing, you know. And so, and also one other thing too, we did an art and activism workshop for SURFA a while ago. And one of the things that I brought up was about how do you write a great song that is specific but also universal? How do Woody Guthrie was a master of that. You know, this land is your land. He's got a lot of political commentary. Unfortunately, more political verses usually don't get sung. But the point is, he's writing about universality, and that is really the kind of songs to me that really survive, you know, because they are universal. And you're talking about that. I like to hear, you know, you're talking about your methodology of how you write and how you make historical events, you know, universal, which is also what I try to do in my own songwriting. So, you know, I really appreciate a lot of the stuff that you've said about your process of songwriting. And by the way, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. I didn't get to tell everybody.
Oh, great. A lot of good songwriters there.
We do have a lot of songwriters here. You can learn the craft of songwriting, but don't expect the music industry to be willing to put your songs out. Forget it. But you can't craft here. So we're trying to meld the craft with writing songs of significance, the craft that we've learned here. So anyway, thanks.
And if anybody hasn't been to Nashville, like, I mean, there are so many amazing musicians living in Nashville. I haven't been there in years, but when I was there, so many of those country musicians are actually bluegrass musicians. I mean, that's the music they love is bluegrass, and they play bluegrass for fun. And you can go into cafes all up and down the strip, and I mean, last time I was there, and you hear some amazing bluegrass musicians playing for like tips or whatever. I mean, it's just as sad, but yeah, it's a great place full of music. But yeah, those Woody Guthrie songs, I mean, the stuff that seemed completely only relevant maybe for, I mean, it's just telling a story about something that happened at a particular time, but it's absolutely relevant. And of course, a song like the Ludlow Massacre or the Massacre of 1913, while they're specifically about specific events, they're relevant because everybody knows that that this is the kind of stuff that has happened in the course of trying to build the labor movement. So that's like, yeah. So people, even if it's not the kind of like sing along kind of stuff like Preacher and the Slave or This Land Is Your Land or something like that has more kind of just general kind of fight songs. The ones that are just about historical events last just as well, I would say. And also worth noting that, as anybody who's read the introduction to A People's History of the United States knows, that Howard Zinn first heard about the Ludlow Massacre from Woody Guthrie. And I know a lot of historians who have first heard about various historical events, including historical events that are more or less within their area of expertise, who first heard about them from songs. So that's definitely a thing. Were there other people on the stack?
I think we got the last person on the stack actually is Paul, and maybe so Paul, come on up to the microphone.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things you said, David, that had me kind of scratching my head a little bit was when you said, don't tell the audience what you think or what your perspective is, because I can see how that's an effective songwriting technique, to write songs that don't convey your perspective. But I mean, I'm also thinking of a lot of songs that I consider to be good songs that, definitely tell the audience what the writer is thinking. Like, for example, I Ain't Marching Anymore by Phil Oakes, War on the Workers by Ann Feeney, Masters of War by Bob Dylan. I mean, those are just a few that come to mind. I mean, so do you think those are ineffective songs, or what? What's your thought on that?
I think those songs all fall into the category of anthemic songs. So I would say that they're all really great songs, and they all play that role as anthemic songs really well. But also, like, I Ain't Marching Anymore, and you mentioned three songs. That
Masters of War and War on the Workers by Ann Feeney.
War on the Workers and I Ain't Marching Anymore, I think, are also great examples of songs that are basically sort of giving examples without necessarily telling you specifically what the songwriter thinks or feels. But then the chorus, the refrain, there's a war on the workers, or I ain't marching anymore. There's a brief refrain that does communicate a perspective. But I find that the best storytelling songs, or best songs generally, are often, if there's a perspective being communicated, it's just in that one little refrain, just in the chorus. I mean, Masters of War is, it's also telling about each verse is also about specifically something, like, so it's a specific aspect of the problem. So I mean, so it's also not just talking about what Dylan thought or feel. It's describing, and which is why it's so powerful, I think. But it's you can convey a perspective really well without necessarily really overtly saying what you think or what you feel, beyond something like a refrain like I ain't marching anymore, which is more a statement of what you're not doing or doing. It's not necessarily what you think or feel. And if it were like if the chorus were I really hate war instead of I ain't marching anymore, the song would suck, right? And you can see how it suck, right? Because nobody wants to hear that Phil Oakes really hates war. They want to hear that he isn't marching anymore. That's totally different. It's the same, but it's totally different. And you see what I mean, right? That's he is actually describing more than telling you what he feels or thinks, and that's why it's so good.
Mhm.
But I mean, which is not to say that people don't know what he thinks or feels. I mean, it's very clear he's against war, and especially imperial war. It's very clear from all the examples. But that's clear from the examples more than that he's actually telling you anything about his feeling or thinking. And the reason is the thing about telling people what you think or you feel, and the reason why it tends not to work so well in songwriting, if it's done too directly, is that it's that the act of telling somebody what you think or what you feel rather than describing a situation and leading them to think or feel as a result of hearing about what you're talking about, and it robs them of their ability to draw their own intellectual or emotional conclusions if you already tell them what yours were. And then if you don't tell them, if you withhold that little bit of information, not that you're really withholding it, like, I mean, it's very clear, from the examples, from the lyrics, but if you kind of withhold that by not actually crying when you sing the sad song, it'll make it so much more powerful if you don't cry. Not that I'm encouraging anybody to repress their emotions, but if you're on stage and you don't cry, your audience will cry more.
So give me an example, if you can, of a song that you think ineffectively uses too much of expressing the writer's point of view. Can you think of anything to illustrate that point?
No, because none of us have heard them. I mean, unless it was at an open mic at PMN, in which case you've heard a lot of them, and which is not to say anything, but this is how it is. If you go to an open mic or any number of other situations, or if you're hanging out with a bunch of people who don't normally write political songs, who are trying to write political songs, or like songwriters who don't normally do that, and now they're trying to do that, I mean, there's a lot of different situations you can put yourself in where you can hear a lot of bad political songs. Like that's really easy to do, right? Because a lot of people are writing political songs. Some of them are really good. A lot of them aren't. And, but those ones that aren't so good, they don't go down in history. I mean, Joe Hill and Woody Guthrie and Phil Oakes and Bob Dylan, they didn't write songs like that. They wrote the kinds of songs I'm describing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I just feel that Paul's question brings up something very interesting, which is, just to note, one of the things David said kind of early on was he really located his own songwriting as focusing on a particular type of song, and you've actually delineated what some of the other types are, right? And I would be really interesting to sort of reproduce this format that we have today with a different songwriter who would define their own songwriting in kind of a little bit of a different category than where David is. Yeah, because it really, it's we've with today's session, which by the way, I don't know how, well, maybe this is a question for you, David, but how much, like if you were a songwriter who focused on different kinds of songs, for instance, how much that would affect sessions 2 and 3. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, but
no,
but anyway, I'm just
would have no
that
impact.
for intention for the future of our programs here.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't have any impact on sessions 2 or 3 in terms of, because getting your music out there and crowdsourcing are really universal things that it's not even necessarily relevant for it doesn't necessarily matter if it's especially political music, even, for sessions 2 or 3. And actually the principles of songwriting that I've been talking about in terms of storytelling are also relevant for not for music that isn't political. I mean, the best love songs are often telling some kind of a story about a situation, with your lover. It's not just describing something or talking about how you feel about your lover. It's often describing something that happened with you and your lover, and that's so powerful. I mean, and that is true. I mean, and I don't know who you'd be finding who would be coming up with a different perspective from what I'm talking about, because what I'm talking about is really the broad body of folk music that's out there. I mean, not just my own music and not just Phil Oakes or Bob Dylan, but you look at all the broad collections of Appalachian songs and English songs and Irish songs, and you will find they are telling stories. that's what is so moving about them. And even a love song, like so many of the love songs, like, I don't know, Lakes of Pontchartrain, the Spancel Hill, her black hair. What's that one? I mean, black is the color. All of these songs are telling stories. And the exception to the storytelling is in the refrain. I mean, of course, the best songs that tell stories may have a refrain, or they may not have a refrain, and they may have a chorus that's long, or they may have a very short chorus. That varies. So there's often that, and the refrains are often where people break the rule of the storytelling, where they're telling you something about what they feel, or how they, what they're thinking about the situation, some kind of universal thing, or they might just be describing some aspect of the situation that has a sort of universal appeal. But the storytelling is more in the verses generally, and there's some.
So maybe we can sum up the big picture that applies to all the different types of songwriting as show as much as possible rather than tell.
I mean, when we're talking about different types of songwriting too, I mean, the principles that I'm talking about in terms of storytelling are not even are not at all limited to whatever genre people might think that I'm doing, or whatever you guys are doing. I mean, this is not just a folk thing, as broad as folk is. This is much broader than that. Although like the sort of folk tradition that many of us here are familiar with does particularly lend itself to storytelling, because it's a wordy form, and storytelling done in the form of rock and roll songs tends to be much more succinct, although it can be done and has been done often, but it's less wordy, and you really got to know what's going on. But yeah, but there's also somebody, was Dell was saying about identifying, and as the importance of identifying as a trans queer songwriter, and I just want to amplify that message in the sense that, like, whether or not as I said before, I don't think you need to be anybody in particular to write about anybody in particular, but at the same time, as Dell said, if you are able to show anybody else that this is something that you can do, whoever you are, and that you can set an example for other people that you can do this too, whatever community you're from, that's great. That's a really important as well. I totally agree. And I just want to say that because I wouldn't want anybody to think that I was trying to make a different point than the one I was making when I said that you don't need to be from a particular group to write about a particular group, currently or historically. Now I'm looking at more.
A comment. So I don't see any hands raised at the moment, but I did see a comment from Chris O'Connor. So perhaps we could use that raise hand function, and or people could, Chris, if you want to unmute, you're welcome to.
Sure. I guess politically speaking, and doing busking and so forth with some of my friends up here in New Hampshire, I guess it's a bigger political question, but how to approach progressive songwritings so we're not always making white people feel like they're guilty and horrible and so forth. And believe me, I know there's plenty out there that is horrible and that needs to be accounted for, but I'm not sure politically that there's not a use for songs that somehow include white people, not necessarily being the evil force of the universe.
I hear that, man. I mean, and I think it's a really important thing that you're talking about. And I just wrote an essay about it, which I just published this morning. But this is what I was talking about before, and I don't know if I can't remember if I finished that point, but I think 1921. What happened in 1921 of great significance in this country? One of the things that happened was the Tulsa Race Massacre. And that has been receiving a lot of attention, as it should. And it never should have been hidden history in the first place, and everybody should have known about it. And a lot of, it, of course, never should have happened. But it did, and now we know about it. And another thing that happened in 1921 was the biggest multiracial armed uprising in the history of the United States, the Battle of Blair Mountain. Nobody's talking about it in the media. And it was 1 month ago, 100 years ago this month. And and there are reasons why PBS and the corporate media almost completely ignores labor history. There's a reason why Ken Burns does all these documentaries about anything other than labor history. Labor history is virtually ignored by the corporate and so-called public media. That's intentional, because labor history is a history of multiracial solidarity to a large extent. That's a huge part of the labor movement in this and other countries, especially since the beginning of the 20th century, when the IWW formed with its intentionally anti-racist, multiracial, intentionally class reductionist, as they would say today, orientation. It was a very effective orientation to unite the working class of all backgrounds, and to celebrate that as an orientation, to celebrate the identity of the worker as an identity for us all to embrace. That was the Wobblies orientation. It worked really well. They had lots of people from all kinds of backgrounds involved, and that's where I'm coming from. And so, yeah, I think that we need to remember the Tulsa Race Massacre, and I wrote a song about that. And it's on my upcoming album. But I also wrote a song about the Battle of Blair Mountain 17 years ago, and that should also be remembered. And I don't think that you can possibly remember 1921 without remembering the Battle of Blair Mountain. Anybody who's trying to remember 1921 in this country without remembering the Battle of Blair Mountain is doing a terrible disservice to the whole fight against racism in this country, which has been a fight that has involved white people as well throughout the history of the labor movement, ever since white people realized that, along with everybody else, realized that the bosses were using the racial divide in this country to keep the working class divided by hiring scab labor from other, marginalized groups that had just immigrated, whether they were from, Southern Europe or from the Southern United States or whatever. And this is a long-standing history here, and the history of resisting that kind of racism is a long-standing history. And you're not hearing about it in the past couple of years on the media, not because, historians don't know about it. It's because they don't want to hear from those historians. And I think, that is exactly, we don't need to be singing songs at protests that are necessarily going to make anybody feel bad in New Hampshire. We can celebrate the history of multiracial uprisings that have involved white people, and we can encourage white people to keep on thinking like that, and not to be discouraged by obviously it's discouraging, our history of genocide and slavery. How can that not be discouraging? It's very discouraging. So is the Nazi Holocaust. It's all very discouraging. But we don't need to be defined by the, Germans don't need to be defined by the Nazi Holocaust any more than white Americans need to be defined by genocide and slavery. We all have much more to ourselves as individuals, as communities. It is a fact that the same 3 months after this horrible pogrom in Tulsa, this multiracial uprising in West Virginia, that all happened in 1921. And I don't think we can understand anybody in this country, white or otherwise, without knowing about both of those events.
Powerful stuff, man. I'm noting the time here. We're almost at 6:30, and I was thinking,
and I don't need to rush off, by the way, if anybody wants
right.
to,
We don't have to rush
chat.
off. That's true. But what I would like to do, I'm wondering, David, if you could say just a little more about what to expect with the next two sessions, and maybe after you do that, we could just sort of have a little more free-form hangout for some time, where most of the questions would be directed to you still.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us what's coming up.
So the second segment is the way I, just going along with the way I structured the book is basically the second segment is about once you've written songs and once you've figured out how to play them, in a way that works. And of course, I barely talked about that. But see, this is the thing. We were just talking about songwriting, and there's way too much just in songwriting. We could keep on going with that, but I barely talked about performance, so I'm sorry, but I can get to some of that. But basically, the idea for the second segment is once you have songs that you think are good and that you want to get out there in any form, then how do you do that? And that is a question that basically, like, answering that question now as opposed to answering that question 10 years ago is a completely different answer. So it's a constantly changing situation, all these platforms and the way everything works, and with social media and stuff like that. So I will be diving into the nitty gritty of how to get your music out there so that people might actually hear it. And then the third, and also, maybe not even secondarily, but something down further than that, also getting your music out there in a way that it actually might make you some money. But that's but that's more the third section. The money is the third section more, because the third section is about crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. And one of the things you'll learn in the second section is that there's very little money in music from actually just marketing online, from putting it out there online. Hey, I get 2 million streams a year and I make about $250 a month from that. So, you're not going to probably make a lot of money directly marketing your music on Spotify and stuff like that. But if you do have 2 million streams a year, that represents a lot of people. And you can then crowdfund from your very select core audience, that maybe 1% of that group. And that's what I'll be talking about in the third section, is how to appeal to the 1% of your core audience that actually wants to give you money because they like your music so much that they want to keep you in business and send you money every month, which is what Patreon and all these other kind of sort of ongoing recurring crowdfunding platforms are about. But we can also talk about crowdfunding specific events or albums or stuff like that, which is becoming less of a thing than just crowdfunding your life generally, which is much more what I'll be talking about in the third section, which is not what I would have been talking about if I had just done this workshop 5 years ago, but things have changed since then. So I'll be talking about Patreon more than Kickstarter.
And I'm posting into the chat right now David's actual own Patreon, which I'm a subscriber to. Thank you so much for
click on that and find out what Patreon is for those who asked, or you can talk a lot more about it. But it's basically like recurring. It's basically a platform for sharing your art in various ways that are really nice and easy to share, and then in doing it on a platform that where people can donate to give you a recurring $2 or $5 a month in exchange for all this free content. And you can also put out some exclusive content if you want to as well. And so that's, which is also a useful thing to do now and then. And I'll talk about all of that in far more detail in the third workshop.
Well, thank you, David, so much for this. I'll stop the recording and then we can hang out and have a few more questions.